Some folks will tell you that pity is a kind thing, that looking at someone and feeling sorry for them means you've still got a good heart. But I've lived long enough to know that pity can be the most dangerous mistake a person can make, because it blinds you to what's really standing right in front of you. And that's exactly what happened the day Clara Whitmore stepped down from that eastbound train just outside a dry little town in West Texas, where the wind carried more dust than mercy, and folks measured a person's worth in land, livestock, and how straight they held their shoulders under the sun. And when she first set her boots on that wooden platform, nobody saw anything worth remembering. Not in that faded calico dress that had been washed too many times to hold its color. Not in the small, scuffed trunk she carried like it was the last thing she owned in the world. And certainly not in the way she stood there alone after the train pulled away, with no one stepping forward to greet her. No hat tipped, no name called. Just the long whistle fading into the open sky and the quiet that follows when a place decides you don't matter much. And if you had been there, you might have thought the same as the others did, that she was just another poor mail-order bride who'd come too far on too little, hoping for something better and finding herself standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because people began to look at her the way they do when they've already made up their minds. Quick glances first, then longer ones, the kind that lingered just enough to measure what you're worth before turning away. And there was a woman near the water barrel who shook her head slow, like she'd seen this story before, and a man leaning against the hitching post who muttered something under his breath about how some folks ought to know better than to come west with empty hands. And Clara heard every bit of it, though she didn't turn her head, didn't flinch, didn't offer a word in her own defense, just stood there with her hands folded lightly over the handle of that worn trunk, her posture straight in a way that didn't quite match the rest of her. And that was the first thing that didn't sit right, though no one could have said why. Because a person who's truly broken tends to fold in on themselves, shoulders dropping, eyes lowering. But Clara Whitmore held herself like she'd been taught to take up exactly the space she needed and not an inch less. And when the station master finally walked over, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days, he looked her up and down with that same quiet judgment and asked in a tone that carried more doubt than welcome if she was expected by someone. And she met his eyes without hesitation and said, calm as still water, that she believed she was. And there was something in the way she said it that made him pause just a fraction longer than he meant to, because it didn't sound like hope, and it didn't sound like fear either. It sounded like certainty dressed in humble clothes. And that, more than anything, was what nobody there knew how to read, because they saw the dress, the dust on her boots, the smallness of her belongings, and they decided her story for her before she ever had the chance to speak it. And if there's one thing this world has a habit of doing, it's mistaking quiet strength for weakness and simple clothes for an empty life. And by the time the wind shifted across that platform, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant cattle, nearly everyone had already settled on the same conclusion, that Clara Whitmore was someone to be pitied, and not a single soul there had the faintest idea just how wrong they were. The trouble with small towns is not that they are unkind, but that they are certain. And by the time Clara Whitmore stepped away from the platform and onto the hard-packed dirt road that led toward the center of town, most of the people there had already decided exactly who she was, and more importantly, what she was not. And that kind of certainty has a way of spreading faster than dust on a dry wind, settling into every glance and every quiet word passed between neighbors who believed they were simply stating facts rather than shaping a life. And so by the time Clara reached the row of weathered buildings that made up the heart of the place, the general store, the boarding house, and the narrow front of a mercantile with sun-faded fabric hanging in the window, there were already eyes waiting for her, watching from behind glass panes and shaded porches, measuring her again and again as if the answer might change on a second look. But it never did, because she still carried that same small trunk, still wore that same worn dress, and still walked without hurry, without apology, like a woman who had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. And that, more than anything, unsettled them in a way they could not quite name, though none of them would have said it out loud, because it is easier to dismiss a person than to admit you do not understand them. And so the whispers began in earnest, soft at first, carried behind hands and half-turned shoulders, then louder as familiarity gave them permission, someone noting that she must have come in on the morning train. Another saying no man had come to meet her, which meant she had either been forgotten or never expected in the first place. And both possibilities earn the same kind of quiet sympathy that feels an awful lot like distance. And Clara moved through it all without breaking stride, her boots lifting small clouds of dust with each step, her gaze steady, not challenging, not pleading, just present. And when she reached the boarding house, a narrow place with a porch that sagged slightly at the corners, she paused only long enough to shift the weight of her trunk before climbing the 3 wooden steps that creaked under her. And the door opened before she had the chance to knock, revealing a woman with a tight bun and eyes that had learned to read people quickly, the kind of eyes that saw Clara and placed her in a category before a single word was spoken. And yet Clara did not shrink under that look, did not rush to explain herself or offer up a story to soften the judgment. She simply said, in that same calm voice that carried neither pride nor shame, that she was looking for a place to stay and would pay for a week if there was a room available. And the woman hesitated, just for a breath, because something in the way Clara spoke did not quite match the picture in front of her, but habit won out over instinct, and she stepped aside, gesturing toward the narrow hallway inside. And as Clara crossed the threshold, carrying her small trunk into a space that smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, the woman glanced once more at the dress, the worn edges, the quiet composure, and shook her head almost imperceptibly, as if confirming to herself what she had already decided, that this was a woman to be taken in, perhaps, but not one to be taken seriously. And outside, the town continued on as it always did, unaware that the story they thought they understood had not even begun to unfold. By the next morning, Clara Whitmore had already become a story, and not the kind a person gets to tell for themselves, but the kind that passes from table to table, from one cup of coffee to the next, shaped and reshaped by people who have never spoken a single word to the subject of it. And in a town like this, stories tend to settle quickly into something that feels like truth, especially when they fit neatly into what folks expect to see, and Clara fit too easily into a familiar shape. The lone bride who arrived with little and less, the woman who must have been sent for and then forgotten, or worse, the kind no one came for at all. And by mid-morning, her name had been spoken enough times that it began to sound like a conclusion instead of a question. And yet none of those voices had been inside the small room she rented at the end of the narrow hallway. None of them had seen the way she set her belongings down with care. Not the kind of care that comes from fear of losing what little you have, but the kind that comes from knowing the value of every object in your possession. And when she opened her trunk, there was no clutter inside, no excess, only a few neatly folded dresses, a small wrapped bundle, and a leather-bound book that she placed on the narrow table by the window with a steadiness that suggested it mattered more than anything else in the room. And if anyone had been there to see it, they might have noticed the way her fingers lingered on the cover for just a moment before she let go, not with hesitation, but with recognition, like greeting something familiar after a long journey. And then she moved about the room with quiet purpose, opening the window just enough to let in the dry morning air, straightening the thin quilt on the bed, and setting her boots side by side, as though she expected them to be there for a long while, not like someone passing through. And when she finally stepped back out onto the street, the town met her with the same measuring looks as before, though now there was a hint of curiosity woven into them, because people had begun to wonder what she would do next, and Clara did not wander or hesitate. She walked directly to the general store, the bell above the door giving a soft chime as she entered, and inside, the air held the scent of flour, tobacco, and oiled wood, and the man behind the counter looked up with the same quick calculation everyone else had shown, placing her again in that neat little box, marked poor and in need. And yet when Clara spoke, asking for the price of basic supplies, her voice carried a clarity that did not match the assumption, and she listened carefully to each answer, not nodding along out of politeness, but weighing the numbers as if they mattered, as if they were part of something larger than a single purchase. And when she paid, she did so without fumbling, without counting twice, placing the exact amount on the counter in a way that suggested she had known the total before he finished speaking. And that was the second thing that did not quite fit, though the shopkeeper could not have said why, only that he found himself watching her a moment longer than necessary as she gathered her things and stepped back out into the sunlight, where the dust still drifted across the street, and the town still held its quiet judgments close, unaware that with each small, careful movement, Clara Whitmore was already beginning to unsettle the story they had written about her. By late afternoon, the town had settled into that slow rhythm that comes when the sun leans heavy over the rooftops and every shadow stretches long across the dust. And it was then that Eli Mercer rode in from the North Trail, his horse moving at an easy pace that spoke of long miles behind him and more still to come. And he did not look like a man concerned with anything beyond his own work, hat pulled low, shoulders steady, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but carried it all the same. And folks noticed him the way they always did, with quiet respect and a touch of distance, because Eli Mercer was not a man people spoke lightly around, not because he was harsh, but because he was precise, and there is something about a man who wastes neither words nor time that makes others choose theirs more carefully. And as he guided his horse past the general store, he caught the tail end of a conversation drifting out through the open door, a voice remarking on the new girl in town, the poor bride no one had come for, and another voice adding that she had taken a room at the boarding house and did not look like she had much to her name. And Eli did not turn his head, but something in the way the words were said lingered just enough to settle in his mind, not as gossip, but as a detail filed away without judgment, the way a man notes the weather or the condition of a fence line. And he rode on toward the far end of the street where the hitching post stood near the feed store, swinging down from the saddle with a quiet ease that came from years of repetition. And as he tied off the reins, his gaze moved once across the street without intention, just a glance, the kind a man gives the world around him to keep track of it. And that was when he saw her for the first time, not as a story passed between others, but as a person standing in the open light, Clara Whitmore holding a small parcel in her hands, her figure still in that same worn dress, unchanged in any outward way. And yet something about the way she stood did not align with what he had just heard, because there was no hesitation in her posture, no searching look in her eyes. She was not scanning the street for help or approval. She was simply there, present in a way that felt settled rather than uncertain. And Eli's attention held for a moment longer than it might have for anyone else, not because she drew it, but because she did not, and that absence of need, that quiet steadiness, marked her as something different from the picture painted by the voices he had overheard. And he noticed in the smallest of things, the way she shifted the parcel from one hand to the other with care rather than clumsiness, the way her gaze moved across the storefronts not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she were measuring rather than wondering. And it was a subtle difference, one most would miss. But Eli Mercer had built a life on noticing what did not fit, on reading the small signs that told a deeper truth than appearances ever could. And though he did not approach her, did not speak or offer any greeting, something quiet and unspoken settled into place in his mind, not a conclusion, not yet, but the beginning of a question. And as Clara turned and walked back toward the boarding house, her steps even, her head held level, Eli found himself watching just long enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect, that whatever story the town had decided on, it was not the whole of it, and in a place where most people saw only what they expected to see, that alone was enough to make her worth noticing. Morning came early in a town like this, not because the sun rose faster, but because the work did, and by the time the first lights stretched thin across the horizon, Clara Whitmore was already awake. The small room she had taken on the second floor, holding the faint chill of night air that had not yet burned away, and she moved through it quietly, not with the restless energy of someone uncertain, but with the steady rhythm of a person who understood the value of beginning before the day demanded it. And when she stepped downstairs, the boarding house kitchen was still half in shadow, the stove cold, the long wooden table bare except for a tin coffee pot left from the night before, and she paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but observation, her gaze moving across the room the way it had across the street the day before, taking measure of what was needed, what was missing, and what could be made better with a small effort. And without asking permission, she set to work, not boldly, not as if claiming the space, but as if restoring something that had been left undone, her hands moving with quiet familiarity as she lit the stove, measured out coffee, and found the small sack of flour tucked in the corner cabinet. And there was nothing hurried in the way she did it, no wasted motion. Just a calm sequence of actions that suggested she had done this before in places that mattered more than this one. And by the time the first board creaked on the stairs and the landlady made her way down, expecting to begin her own routine, the kitchen was already warm, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air, and two plates sat side by side on the table, not set for show, not arranged for approval, but placed with the quiet assumption that a day begins better when shared. And the woman stopped in the doorway, her hand still on the railing, eyes narrowing, slightly not in suspicion, but in something closer to surprise, because the girl she had taken in as a burden had not asked for anything, had not waited to be told, had simply done what needed doing. And Clara did not look up right away, did not announce herself or explain her actions. She just poured coffee into 2 cups and slid one across the table as if it had always belonged there. And when she finally met the woman's eyes, there was no request in her expression, no attempt to earn favor. Only a quiet acknowledgement that the morning had begun, and this was how she chose to meet it. And outside, the town carried on with its usual rhythm, unaware that within the walls of a small boarding house, the story they had settled on was already beginning to shift, not through grand gestures or loud declarations, but through something far smaller and far more difficult to dismiss. The steady presence of a woman who did not behave like someone with nothing, and though no one there would have said it yet, there was a difference between being poor and being diminished, and Clara Whitmore was proving, one small act at a time, that she was not the latter. By the third morning, Clara Whitmore was no longer invisible, though no one would have said she was important either. She had settled into that quiet middle space where a person is noticed just enough to be talked about, but not enough to be understood. And that is often where the most dangerous misunderstandings take root, because people begin to build explanations for what they cannot quite place, and Clara gave them just enough to wonder, not through anything she said, but through the small, steady way she moved through each day. And it started with things that did not seem worth mentioning on their own, like the way she kept a small scrap of paper folded neatly in her apron pocket, taking it out now and then to mark something with a short pencil she carried, not idly, not as a habit, but with purpose, as if every number she wrote down mattered. And the first person to notice was the shopkeeper, a man who had spent most of his life counting goods and measuring worth by weight and price. And when Clara came in again that morning, he watched her more closely than before, watched the way her eyes moved across the shelves, not wandering, not comparing, but selecting with quiet certainty. And when she asked about the cost of flour by the pound and beans by the sack, her questions were not the kind that came from guesswork. She did not ask what was cheapest, she asked what lasted, what held through a dry season, what kept its quality when the weather turned. And the shopkeeper found himself answering differently than he did for others, speaking with a little more care, because something in her attention demanded it. And when she made her purchase, she adjusted her list without hesitation, subtracting one thing, adding another, her pencil moving quick and sure. And it was not the act itself that caught his notice, but the ease of it, the way she handled numbers like they were familiar ground, not something to be stumbled through. And later that afternoon, when a delivery man stopped by the boarding house to settle a small account with the landlady, Clara happened to be standing nearby, drying her hands on a cloth, and though she said nothing at first, her eyes moved once over the paper in his hand, just a glance, but long enough to register something that did not sit right. And she spoke then, not loudly, not to correct, but to ask, her voice calm, pointing out a figure that had been carried over wrong, a small error, easy to miss, but not to her. And the delivery man frowned, checked again, then nodded, adjusting the total with a shrug that suggested it was nothing more than a simple mistake. But the landlady looked at Clara differently after that, not with warmth, not yet, but with a narrowing of thought, as if the shape she had placed Clara into no longer fit quite as neatly as it had before. And word of that small correction traveled the way things do in a town like this, quiet at first, then gaining weight as it passed from one person to another, until by evening, there was a new tone beneath the old story, not enough to replace it, but enough to shift it, because now Clara Whitmore was not just the girl who arrived with nothing. She was also the girl who knew things she should not. And across the street, as Eli Mercer stood near the hitching post, rolling a length of rope through his hands with slow, practiced movements, He heard that piece of talk carried on the wind between two men who did not know he was listening, and he did not interrupt, did not ask questions, but the rope stilled in his hands for just a moment, and his gaze drifted toward the boarding house, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging that the question he had felt the day before had not gone away. It had only grown a little sharper, and in a place where most people were satisfied with simple answers, Eli Mercer had learned to pay attention when something refused to stay simple. There is a particular kind of evening that settles over a place like this, when the heat finally loosens its grip and the air turns just cool enough to make a person pause before heading inside. And on that kind of evening, people tend to gather where there is food and light and the comfort of familiar voices, and the boarding house dining room filled slowly, chairs scraping against the wooden floor, the low murmur of conversation rising and falling like a tide that had nowhere urgent to go. And Clara Whitmore moved among it all with the same quiet steadiness she had shown since the day she arrived, setting plates, pouring coffee, not as someone serving, but as someone participating in a rhythm she understood. And when she finally took her seat at the far end of the table, there was a brief moment, almost too small to notice, where the conversation shifted, not stopping, not fully, but bending around her presence as people adjusted to having her there. And it was in that small pause that Eli Mercer stepped through the doorway, drawn, not by curiosity, at least not the kind he would admit to, but by the simple fact that he had business in town and the boarding house was the only place still serving a hot meal at that hour. And he removed his hat as he entered, nodding once to the room without seeking acknowledgement, and the landlady gestured toward an open chair halfway down the table, though the only empty seat within easy reach happened to be across from Clara, and Eli took it without comment, lowering himself into the chair with that same quiet economy of movement that marked everything he did. And for a time, there was nothing unusual in the way the meal unfolded, plates passed, coffee poured, the soft clink of utensils against enamel, the kind of ordinary moment that reveals more than any grand event ever could. And Clara did not look up at him right away, did not study him the way others might have. She simply ate, steady and unhurried. And Eli, for his part, did not speak beyond what was necessary, offering a brief thanks when the plate was set before him, his voice low, carrying no more weight than the words required. And yet there was an awareness between them, not shared, not acknowledged, but present all the same, like two people standing on opposite sides of a quiet river, each aware of the other without needing to cross. And it was a small thing that bridged that space, so small that most would have missed it entirely. The moment when Clara reached for the coffee pot at the same time Eli did, their hands pausing just short of contact, and she withdrew first without apology, without embarrassment, simply allowing him to pour before she reached again, and Eli noticed the way she did it, not yielding out of hesitation, but out of choice. A subtle distinction that settled somewhere in the back of his mind, and later, when the conversation turned to the state of the land, the dry spell that had stretched longer than expected, one of the men at the table made a passing remark about how nothing could be done until the weather changed, and Clara spoke then, not to interrupt, not to challenge, but to offer a quiet observation about water conservation and crop rotation she had seen used elsewhere, her words measured, precise, and the table grew still for a moment, not because what she said was outlandish, but because it was accurate in a way that did not match the image they had formed of her, and Eli's gaze lifted then, meeting hers for the first time, not with surprise, not with approval, but with recognition, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. And Clara held that look just long enough to acknowledge it before returning her attention to her plate, and nothing more was said, not then, not by either of them. But in that quiet exchange, something shifted, small and almost imperceptible, the first thread of connection not built on words or expectation, but on the simple, undeniable fact that neither of them was quite what they appeared to be, and in a town that preferred its stories simple, that alone was enough to begin unraveling everything. By the next day, the air in town carried a different kind of weight, not heavier exactly, but sharper, like something unseen had shifted just enough to catch on the edges of people's thoughts. And it did not take long for that shift to find its voice, because there are always those who feel the need to press against what they do not understand, to test it, to push it back into something familiar. And that morning, It came in the form of a woman named Mrs. Calder, who had lived in that town long enough to believe she understood the measure of everyone in it, and she made no effort to soften her presence as she stepped into the boarding house kitchen, her boots firm against the floor, her gaze already fixed on Clara Whitmore with a kind of polite disregard that barely bothered to hide itself. And Clara was standing at the table, sleeves rolled just slightly, her hands dusted with flour as she worked through the simple task of preparing bread, her movements steady, unhurried, and she did not stop when Mrs. Calder entered, did not look up right away, only finished what she was doing before turning her attention to the room. And there was something in that small delay that unsettled more than any sharp word might have, because it suggested that Clara did not rearrange herself to meet another person's expectations. And Mrs. Calder noticed it, though she would not have said so, choosing instead to speak in that careful tone people use when they intend to be heard by more than one set of ears, remarking that it was a fine thing to see someone keeping busy, especially when they did not have much else to offer, and the words settled into the space between them, not loud, not openly unkind, but edged just enough to carry their meaning. And Clara met them without flinching, wiping her hands on a cloth before answering, her voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, simply present, saying that keeping a place in order was rarely a small thing, especially when others depended on it. And for a moment, there was silence, the kind that does not come from a lack of words, but from the sudden realization that something expected had not happened, because Clara had not lowered herself, had not accepted the place being offered to her. And Mrs. Calder's expression tightened just slightly. Her certainty nudged off balance, though not enough to abandon it entirely, and she shifted her weight, glancing toward the landlady as if to confirm what she already believed, adding that some folks come west thinking hard work alone will carry them, when what they really need is good fortune. And at that, Clara's gaze held steady, not challenging, not yielding, just acknowledging the words as they were, and she replied that sometimes the two were not as separate as people like to think, that what looks like fortune often begins with knowing where to place your effort, and there was a quiet confidence in the way she said it, not loud, not proud, but grounded in something that did not need to be proven. And across the room, the landlady watched with a growing stillness, her earlier assumptions loosening one thread at a time, and though no one there would have admitted it, the balance had shifted again, because Mrs. Calder had come expecting to define Clara, and instead found herself uncertain of the shape she was dealing with. And outside, near the hitching posts where the morning lights stretched long across the dust, Eli Mercer paused in the act of tightening a saddle strap as the open window carried fragments of that exchange into the street, and he did not look up immediately, did not move to listen more closely, but the faintest hint of something like understanding settled into his expression, not because he had heard every word, but because he did not need to. He had already seen enough to know that Clara Whitmore was not a woman who fit easily into the stories other people told about her, and in a place where most folks held tight to simple explanations, that alone was enough to make her stand apart in a way that would not stay unnoticed for long. By the next day, the air in town carried a different kind of weight, not heavier exactly, but sharper, like something unseen had shifted just enough to catch on the edges of people's thoughts. And it did not take long for that shift to find its voice, because there are always those who feel the need to press against what they do not understand, to test it, to push it back into something familiar. And that morning, it came in the form of a woman named Mrs. Calder, who had lived in that town long enough to believe she understood the measure of everyone in it, and she made no effort to soften her presence as she stepped into the boarding house kitchen, her boots firm against the floor, her gaze already fixed on Clara Whitmore with a kind of polite disregard that barely bothered to hide itself. And Clara was standing at the table, sleeves rolled just slightly, her hands dusted with flour as she worked through the simple task of preparing bread, her movements steady, unhurried, and she did not stop when Mrs. Calder entered, did not look up right away, only finished what she was doing before turning her attention to the room. And there was something in that small delay that unsettled more than any sharp word might have, because it suggested that Clara did not rearrange herself to meet another person's expectations, and Mrs. Calder noticed it, though she would not have said so, choosing instead to speak in that careful tone people use when they intend to be heard by more than one set of ears, remarking that it was a fine thing to see someone keeping busy, especially when they did not have much else to offer, and the words settled into the space between them, not loud, not openly unkind, but edged just enough to carry their meaning, and Clara met them without flinching, wiping her hands on a cloth before answering, her voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, simply present, saying that keeping a place in order was rarely a small thing, especially when others depended on it. And for a moment, there was silence, the kind that does not come from a lack of words, but from the sudden realization that something expected had not happened, because Clara had not lowered herself, had not accepted the place being offered to her. And Mrs. Calder's expression tightened just slightly, her certainty nudged off balance, though not enough to abandon it entirely, and she shifted her weight, glancing toward the landlady as if to confirm what she already believed, adding that some folks come west thinking hard work alone will carry them, when what they really need is good fortune. And at that, Clara's gaze held steady, not challenging, not yielding, just acknowledging the words as they were, and she replied that sometimes the two were not as separate as people like to think, that what looks like fortune often begins with knowing where to place your effort, and there was a quiet confidence in the way she said it, not loud, not proud, but grounded in something that did not need to be proven. And across the room, the landlady watched with a growing stillness, her earlier assumptions loosening one thread at a time, and though no one there would have admitted it, the balance had shifted again, because Mrs. Calder had come expecting to define Clara, and instead found herself uncertain of the shape she was dealing with. And outside, near the hitching posts where the morning light stretched long across the dust, Eli Mercer paused in the act of tightening a saddle strap as the open window carried fragments of that exchange into the street, and he did not look up immediately, did not move to listen more closely, but the faintest hint of something like understanding settled into his expression, not because he had heard every word, but because he did not need to. He had already seen enough to know that Clara Whitmore was not a woman who fit easily into the stories other people told about her, and in a place where most folks held tight to simple explanations, that alone was enough to make her stand apart in a way that would not stay unnoticed for long. The trouble with problems in a place like this is that they do not arrive all at once. They creep in slow and quiet, settling into ledgers and fences and fields until one morning a man wakes up and realizes something that once stood firm has begun to give way. And that was the kind of morning Eli Mercer found himself standing in, just outside the feed store with a folded paper in his hand that had been read too many times to offer any comfort, the numbers on it simple enough to understand and heavy enough to ignore. And though he did not speak of it to anyone, the weight of it showed in the set of his shoulders, in the way he lingered a moment longer than usual before moving on, because land could be worked and cattle could be counted, but figures written in ink had a way of binding a man tighter than rope ever could. And inside the boarding house, word of it had already begun to move, not as gossip exactly, but as concern shaped into quiet speculation, a mention here, a question there, until it reached the kitchen where Clara Whitmore stood near the window, the morning light catching the edge of that same small leather-bound book she had placed beside her cup of coffee. And she did not ask for the paper, did not step forward with advice. She simply listened as the landlady spoke in low tones about debts coming due and the uncertainty of the next season, and Clara's expression did not change, but her fingers rested lightly on the cover of that book as if measuring something unseen. And later, when Eli stepped inside for a midday meal, the room held a different kind of quiet, not empty, not tense, but attentive, as though the air itself had taken note of what he carried with him, and he sat at the table without comment, setting the folded paper beside his plate in a gesture so small most would have missed it, but Clara did not, her gaze touching it only once before returning to her work, and when she brought the coffee, she set it down near his hand with the same steady care she showed in everything. And for a while there was nothing but the ordinary sounds of a meal, the scrape of chair legs, the low murmur of voices, until Eli unfolded the paper again, not to show it, not to explain, but because some things demand to be faced more than once. And that was when Clara spoke, not into the room, not to draw attention, but to him, her voice low and even, asking if the figures accounted for the last shipment that had been delayed, And it was such a specific question that Eli looked up before answering, his eyes narrowing just slightly as if weighing whether to dismiss it or consider it. And he chose the latter, because something in the way she asked did not feel like guesswork. And he said that they did, though the numbers had not settled as expected, and Clara nodded once, as if confirming a thought she had already begun to form, and she reached then, not for the paper, but for her own small book, opening it with a quiet familiarity and turning it toward him just enough to show a column of neatly written figures. Nothing elaborate, nothing showy, just clear, careful entries that spoke of attention and discipline, and she pointed to a line without touching his page, suggesting that if the cost of feed had been calculated before the delay, then the actual burden might be less than it appeared, provided the timing was adjusted, and she said it simply, without insistence, without claiming to be right, as though offering a piece of information rather than a solution. And Eli studied the figures in silence, his gaze moving from her book to his paper and back again, and there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where something shifted in his expression, not relief, not yet, but recognition of a possibility he had not considered, and he did not thank her, did not question how she knew. He only nodded once, folding his paper again with a little more care than before, and across the table, Clara closed her book and returned to her place without another word, leaving behind not an answer, but the quiet certainty that whatever she carried inside her was far from ordinary, and in a town that had already begun to question its first impression. That small exchange did more than any explanation ever could. It made it impossible to keep believing she was exactly what she seemed. There comes a point in any story where what has been quietly held back can no longer remain hidden, not because someone forces it into the light, but because the truth begins to show through the edges of every small thing. And by the time that moment arrived for Clara Whitmore, it did not come with raised voices or sudden revelation. It came in the form of a man stepping down from a carriage just before noon, his coat too fine for the dust of that town, his boots polished in a way that suggested he did not often walk where others did, and the sight of him drew attention without effort, conversations slowing, glances turning, because strangers of that kind did not pass through without purpose, and he moved with a directness that carried him straight to the boarding house, his gaze scanning the doorway once before stepping inside, as if he already knew what he would find there. And Clara was at the table, her book open, pencil resting against the page, and when she looked up and saw him, there was no surprise in her expression, no confusion, only a stillness that settled into place like something long expected had finally arrived, and the room seemed to narrow around them as the man removed his hat, holding it at his side with a formality that did not belong to that place. And he spoke her name not as a question, but as a certainty, Clara Whitmore, his voice carrying the weight of recognition rather than inquiry. And for a moment, no one else in the room moved. The landlady paused near the stove, another boarder halfway through a sip of coffee, and Clara closed her book with a soft, deliberate motion, her fingers resting on the cover as she answered him with the same calm she had carried since the day she arrived. And though the words between them were few, their meaning did not need explanation. Because the man reached into his coat and produced a folded document, placing it on the table between them with care, not sliding it forward, not presenting it as a challenge, but as something that belonged to her. And Eli Mercer, who had entered just behind him without drawing notice, saw the way Clara's gaze moved over that paper, not with uncertainty, not with curiosity, but with familiarity, as if she had read its contents long before it ever reached her hands. And when she unfolded it, the room held its breath without knowing why, and the man spoke then, explaining in measured terms that there had been inquiries, that her absence had not gone unnoticed, that certain accounts required her signature, and though he did not say the word fortune, it hung there all the same, in the careful language, in the weight of the paper, in the quiet deference in his tone. And Clara listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, until he finished, and then she nodded once, not in agreement, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, and she set the document back on the table as though it carried no more importance than the book beside it. And that was when the room shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but in the way people look at something they thought they understood and realized they never truly saw it at all. And Eli stood there a moment longer than he intended, his gaze moving from the man to Clara and back again, and in that quiet space, the final piece fell into place, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of everything that had never quite added up, and Clara Whitmore, the woman they had pitied, the woman they had measured and dismissed, was no longer a question waiting to be answered. She was the answer itself, and the only thing left uncertain was what she would choose to do with it. There is a kind of silence that follows the truth, not the heavy kind that presses down on a room, but a quieter one that settles into each person differently. And after the man left the boarding house with his hat held carefully against his chest and his words still lingering in the air, that was the silence that remained, stretching between the walls, slipping into the spaces where certainty used to live. And no one spoke right away, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said could not be easily undone. And Clara Whitmore stood where she had been, her hand resting lightly on the closed book, the document still lying untouched beside it. And for a long moment she did not move, as if allowing the weight of that moment to pass through the room before she claimed any part of it for herself. And it was the landlady who shifted first, her earlier assumptions now settling into something quieter, less certain, though she said nothing, only returned to her work with a care that had not been there before, and one by one the others followed, voices low, movements measured, as though the ordinary rhythm of the day had to be relearned in light of what they now knew. And Clara did not address any of it, did not explain, did not offer a story to match the truth that had just been placed before them. She simply reached for her book and opened it once more, her pencil finding its place as if nothing had changed at all, and yet everything had, though the difference was not in her. It was in the way the room now held her, and outside. Eli Mercer stood near the hitching post longer than he intended, his gaze fixed not on the street, but on the doorway she had just stepped through moments before, and there was a question there, not about what she was, because that had been answered, but about what she would choose. And when Clara finally stepped outside, the afternoon light catching the edges of her dress the same way it had the first day she arrived, she paused at the top of the steps, not to gather herself, but to look out across the town that had already decided so much about her. And Eli did not call out, did not step forward to meet her. He simply waited, and when her gaze found him, there was no surprise in it, only recognition, as if she had known he would be there. And she crossed the distance between them with that same steady pace, stopping just short of where he stood, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them holding something unspoken but understood, and it was Eli who broke it, not with a question about the document or the man who had brought it, but with something simpler, asking whether she meant to leave. And Clara's eyes held his for a fraction longer than before, not guarded, not distant, but searching in a way that suggested the answer mattered more than the question. And she said that she had not yet decided, that there had been a time when such things were decided for her, but she had learned the cost of letting others choose the shape of her life, and now she preferred to take her time, even when the path seemed clear. And Eli nodded once, not pressing further, because he understood something in that answer that did not need explanation, and after a moment, he said only that the ranch would still be there tomorrow, that the work would not change, and neither would the need for someone who knew how to see what others missed. And there was no invitation in his words, no claim, only a statement of fact. And Clara let that settle, her gaze shifting briefly toward the open stretch of land beyond the town, then back to him, and something in her expression softened, not into certainty, not yet, but into the beginning of it. And she turned then, not away from him, but toward the path that would lead back to the boarding house. And as she walked, the decision she had not yet spoken began to take shape in the quiet space between what she had been offered and what she had already found. And for the first time since she stepped off that train, the question was no longer whether she had somewhere to go, but whether she had already arrived. Some folks spend their whole lives thinking that what makes a place a home is what is written on paper, a deed, a title, a number carried in ink from one ledger to another. But the truth is, a home has never cared much for what a person owns, only for what they choose to stay for. And the morning Clara Whitmore made her decision did not look any different from the mornings that came before it. The same pale light stretching across the window, the same quiet kitchen waiting to be warmed, the same table that had slowly become something more than just wood and nails. And she moved through it as she always had, lighting the stove, setting out 2 cups, measuring coffee with that same careful hand, not because she had to, but because she had come to understand that small acts done with intention have a way of shaping a life more than any grand declaration ever could. And when the door opened and Eli Mercer stepped inside, carrying the cool air of early morning with him, he paused just slightly at the threshold, not out of surprise, but recognition, because there are moments a man feels before he understands them, and something about the way the room held itself told him that a choice had already been made. And Clara did not turn immediately, did not announce it. She simply poured the coffee and set the second cup in its usual place before taking her seat, and only then did she look up, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that carried no doubt, and there were no long explanations, no recounting of the man who had come the day before or the paper that still rested upstairs in her room. Only a quiet statement, spoken as plainly as anything she had said since arriving, that she would be staying, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had found something worth remaining for. And Eli did not ask her to clarify, did not question what she had given up or what she might still claim. He only nodded once, the weight in that small gesture carrying more than any promise ever could, and he took his seat across from her, reaching for the cup she had set out. And for a while they sat in that shared quiet, the kind that no longer felt like distance, but like understanding. And outside, the town stirred to life, unaware that something simple and steady had just taken root within it. Not a grand event, not a story to be told with raised voices, but the kind that settles and slowly and stays. And in the days that followed, the change did not come in sudden waves. It came in the same small ways it always had. Clara's presence at the ranch becoming as natural as the sunrise, her hands moving through the work with that same quiet certainty, her book open on the table where numbers were written and adjusted with a care that turned strain into stability, and Eli moving through his days with a little less weight in his shoulders, not because his burdens had disappeared, but because they were no longer carried alone. And the town, for its part, learned something it had not expected to learn, that the woman they had once pitied had never needed their sympathy at all, only the chance to stand where she was not dismissed. And in time, the whispers changed, not into praise, not exactly, but into something closer to respect, the kind that grows when people see the truth for long enough that it can no longer be denied. And if you had passed by that ranch on an evening when the lights settled soft across the land, you might have seen 2 figures at the table inside, plates set side by side, the quiet between them no longer empty, but full of something steady and sure. And you might have understood then what so many had missed at the beginning, that being chosen is not about who sees you first, it is about who stays when the seeing is done. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived with nothing the town could measure, had found something far greater than anything written on paper. She had found a place where she was not pitied, not questioned, but known, and more importantly, where she chose to remain.